There is a recording. You can find it online right now. It has been uploaded dozens of times on different platforms. People listen to it out of curiosity, the way people listen to things they have been told are disturbing because they want to test themselves against the idea of being disturbed. Most of them last about 40 seconds before they turn it off. Not because the recording is loud, not because it is violent, not because it contains anything that should, by any rational measure, cause a grown adult to feel what they feel when they hear it. It is a voice, just a voice, a man's voice, distant and strange, speaking in Vietnamese over a low bed of Buddhist funeral music. And it says, translated into English, something so simple and so wrong that the simplicity of it is the thing that gets you. It says, "My friends, I come back to let you know that I am dead." That is the opening line of Ghost Tape number 10, the most classified piece of audio ever produced by the United States military. A recording that was played from helicopter loudspeakers into the Vietnamese jungle at 8 o'clock every night for years, from speakers strapped to the backs of soldiers walking alone through enemy territory in the dark, from equipment hung in trees miles from any American position, so that when the sound drifted through the jungle, there was no source, just the voice, coming from everywhere and nowhere, as if the jungle itself was speaking. A recording that was so effective at destroying the human mind that the United States Army issued a formal order prohibiting it from being played within earshot of their own South Vietnamese allies, because the allies were as terrified of it as the enemy. And a recording that, in ways that the declassified files and the veteran testimony and the documented history of what happened in those jungles can only partially explain, may have done something to the men who made it, something to the men who carried it, something that the jungle gave back. This is the true story of Operation Wandering Soul. What the United States military built in a Saigon sound studio in 1965, what they sent into the darkest places of the Vietnam War, and what happened when the darkness listened. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict the United States military had ever fought, and the people in charge of fighting it understood this from almost the beginning. You cannot understand what Operation Wandering Soul was or why it was created without first understanding the specific nature of the problem the American military faced in Vietnam. Because the problem was not primarily a military one, it was a psychological one. And it was a problem so fundamental, so embedded in the nature of the conflict itself, that no amount of firepower or tactical innovation or technological superiority could address it on its own. The problem was this: the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army soldiers fighting the Americans were not fighting for territory. They were not fighting to hold a line or take a hill or defend a position. They were fighting for something that cannot be bombed or outmaneuvered or neutralized by superior air power. They were fighting for their land, their families, their dead. And in Vietnamese culture specifically, in the deeply held beliefs that shaped every aspect of Vietnamese life and death, the dead were not absent. The dead were present. The dead could intervene in the lives of the living. The dead could suffer. The dead could be in pain. And the dead, if they died improperly, if they were killed far from home, if their bodies were not recovered, if the proper burial rites were not performed, the dead became something terrible. They became wandering souls. In Vietnamese tradition, a soul that cannot rest is not simply sad, it is dangerous. It haunts, it brings misfortune to the living. It cries out from wherever it is trapped in a jungle, in a flooded rice paddy, in the hollow of a tree miles from any village where anyone who loved it can hear it. And it cannot stop. It cannot be comforted. It cannot find peace until someone brings it home. The Americans who designed Operation Wandering Soul understood this. They understood it precisely, clinically, the way a doctor understands a vulnerability in the human body before deciding how to exploit it. They studied Vietnamese beliefs about death and the afterlife. They consulted with South Vietnamese advisors who could explain the specific folklore, the specific fears, the specific images and sounds that had terrified Vietnamese people for generations. They understood that the Viet Cong soldier hiding in a jungle tunnel at 3 in the morning, exhausted and hungry and far from everyone he loved, was not just a military problem to be solved with bullets. He was a human being with a deep and sincere belief that the jungle around him might contain the souls of dead men, and they decided to use that. The man most directly responsible for what became Ghost Tape Number 10 was a United States Army Psychological Operations officer whose name appears in different documents spelled differently, a common confusion in the declassified records of Vietnam-era psychological warfare programs. What is not confused is his assignment. He was attached to the 6th Psychological Operations Battalion, a unit established in Vietnam in November 1965, with a mission that had no precedent in American military history. The 6th PSYOP Battalion's job, stripped to its essence, was to get inside the enemy's head and break something. Not to kill, not to wound, not to capture. To break something in the mind that would make continued fighting feel impossible. To find the place inside a soldier where his courage lived and make that place uninhabitable. For most of the war, this meant leaflets. Hundreds of millions of leaflets dropped from aircraft over enemy positions, containing messages designed to demoralize, descriptions of how well-fed and comfortable American prisoners were being treated, photographs of dead Viet Cong commanders, promises of amnesty for soldiers who surrendered, casualty figures presented in ways designed to make the enemy's losses feel unsurvivable. The leaflets worked, to a degree. They contributed to the defection program known as Chiu Hoi, meaning open arms, which succeeded in bringing tens of thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers over to the South Vietnamese side throughout the war. Defectors consistently reported that American psychological operations had influenced their decision to switch sides. But leaflets had a limitation. They required daylight, they required literacy, and they reached the surface of the mind without touching the deeper places where the most powerful fears lived. What the 6th PSYOP Battalion needed was something that worked in the dark, something that bypassed the rational mind and went directly to whatever was underneath. Something that did not need to be understood to be devastating. They needed sound. The production of Ghost Tape Number 10 began in a recording studio in Saigon in 1965 and continued through various iterations for years. The process was meticulous and deeply strange. First, they needed the voice, not an American voice speaking Vietnamese, not an actor performing fear. They needed the real thing, a Vietnamese voice, a voice carrying the specific weight and texture of genuine grief, performing words that had to sound like they were coming from someone who had actually crossed over. They recruited South Vietnamese soldiers. They recruited Viet Cong defectors, men who had fought for the other side and come over under the Chiu Hoi program, men who knew from personal experience exactly how the enemy soldiers thought, exactly what they feared, exactly what a voice from the jungle at 3 in the morning needed to sound like to make a grown man abandon his position without firing a shot. These men sat in a studio in Saigon and recorded themselves speaking as the dead. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being asked to sit in a room with a microphone and embody, as convincingly as you possibly can, the voice of a man who died far from home and cannot rest. To say into that microphone words that you have been told will be broadcast into the jungle where your former comrades are hiding in the dark. To make them believe, in the hours when the mind is most vulnerable and the darkness is most complete, that the dead are speaking. The South Vietnamese soldiers who recorded those tapes reportedly found the experience deeply disturbing. Some required time before they could be convinced to record. Some asked that the studio be prepared in specific ways, that certain objects be present or absent, that certain words not be said outside the context of the recording itself. The discomfort was real and documented, and it was not the discomfort of embarrassment or technical difficulty. It was the discomfort of people who sincerely believed in what they were being asked to pretend. The final recording, Ghost Tape Number 10, ran for approximately 6 minutes. It contained Buddhist funeral music, the specific instrumentation used in Vietnamese death ceremonies, music that a Vietnamese person hears at funerals and nowhere else, music that the nervous system of someone raised in Vietnamese culture associates at a biological level with death and mourning and grief. Over this music, the voice of the dead soldier spoke. He said, "My friends, I come back to let you know that I am dead. I am dead. It was a senseless death. How senseless, he said. Friends, I am dead. I wander throughout this area, and I am in hell. I am in hell, he said. Go home, friends. Go home before it is too late. And underneath his voice, barely audible at first and then growing, were other voices. The voice of a young girl calling out, "Come home, Daddy. Come home, Daddy. Come home." The voice of a woman weeping. And at certain points in the recording, sounds that were not voices at all. Sounds that the engineers in that Saigon studio had crafted with extreme care to inhabit the specific frequencies that the human nervous system, regardless of culture or training or rational belief, associates with something wrong, something close, something looking at you from the dark. The first operational deployment of Ghost Tape number 10 was at Fire Support Base Chamberlain on the night of February 10, 1970. The Firebase was held by the 1st Battalion of the 27th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Wolfhounds, as part of the 25th Infantry Division. The deployment was simple. At 8 o'clock in the evening, as the jungle surrounding the Firebase went from the gray of dusk to the absolute black of a Vietnamese night, the PSYOP team activated the equipment. The sound emerged into the darkness at a volume calculated through weeks of testing. Loud enough to carry for hundreds of meters through dense jungle. Loud enough to penetrate into the underground tunnels where Viet Cong fighters sheltered, but not so loud that it was immediately obvious where the sound was coming from. The engineers had studied the way sound moved through different types of jungle terrain, and had calibrated the output specifically so that the voice would seem to come from no particular direction. To be everywhere, to be the jungle itself. The account published afterward in the Tropic Lightning News, the division's own newspaper, read as follows. If you were a wolfhound of the 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry, 25th Infantry Division, and were at Fire Support Base Chamberlain on the night of February 10th, you might have sworn the place was being haunted by poltergeists, ghosts that is. The moans, groans, and weird sounds began at 8 that night. That account was written about the American soldiers at the Firebase, the men operating the equipment, the men who knew exactly what the recording was and exactly where it was coming from. They might have sworn the place was being haunted, not the enemy, the Americans. Because here is the thing about Ghost Tape number 10, that the PSYOP manuals and the operational assessments and the declassified debriefs all note but none of them adequately grapple with. It worked on everyone. The engineers who recorded it found the experience disturbing in ways they could not fully explain. The PSYOP officers who deployed it reported that even knowing exactly what the tape was, even having been present for its creation, even understanding every technical element of how it was produced, playing it in the dark, in the jungle, was something different from understanding it in daylight. One PSYOP officer whose account has been preserved in the historical record described the experience of deploying the tape from a helicopter at low altitude over a known Viet Cong position. He said that as the sound played from the helicopter's speakers and drifted down into the canopy below, and as the helicopter banked and the speakers tilted and the voice rose and fell with aircraft's movement, he found himself feeling something that he could not account for and could not dismiss. He said that for a few minutes, in that helicopter over that jungle, he was not entirely certain the voice was coming from the speakers. He never elaborated on what he meant by that. The account ends there. The document moves on to operational assessments and defection statistics and the tactical outcomes of the broadcast. But that sentence is in the historical record, preserved in the archives of a program that the United States military conducted for years in the jungles of Vietnam. He was not entirely certain the voice was coming from the speakers. The operational deployment of Ghost Tape number 10 went far beyond Firebase Chamberlain. The 6th PSYOP Battalion developed multiple methods for getting the recording into the jungle. The most direct involved mounting loudspeakers on UH-1 Huey helicopters, the same helicopters used for troop transport and medevac and everything else in Vietnam, and flying low over enemy positions at night, the sound preceding the aircraft and surrounding it and outlasting it as the helicopter banked away. This method had a significant tactical complication that the records note with striking understatement. When the Viet Cong soldiers heard the recording and understood that it was coming from a helicopter, Some of them opened fire on the helicopter. Not all of them. Many were too frightened, too paralyzed, too deep in whatever the sound had put them in to respond tactically at all. But enough of them recovered their composure and their weapons that flying a slow, moving Huey at low altitude over a Viet Cong position while broadcasting the voices of the dead was not an assignment that American helicopter crews viewed with equanimity, so they developed alternatives. One of the most disturbing, from any perspective you choose to view it, was the deployment of speakers on foot. American soldiers, or South Vietnamese soldiers serving alongside American units, would carry portable speakers into the jungle. Not to the edge of the jungle, into it. Through the dark in enemy-held territory, moving quietly through the same terrain where Viet Cong units were sleeping and standing watch and moving through their tunnel systems. The soldiers would position themselves as close as they could safely get to known enemy positions. They would hang speakers from tree branches. They would set up the equipment at ground level, calibrated to project the sound outward in all directions. And then they would press play and withdraw, leaving the voice in the jungle, standing alone in the dark among the trees with no one to operate it. Just the recording, cycling through its 6 minutes and starting again. The dead man's voice drifting through the canopy, the little girl asking her father to come home, the woman weeping, and those sounds that the engineers had crafted so carefully at frequencies that the nervous system processes before the mind has a chance to intervene. When the equipment was recovered the following morning, it was sometimes not where it had been left. The records describe this with clinical brevity: equipment repositioned, equipment missing. Equipment found at distances from the original placement that could not be explained by wind or animal activity. Some of it was never recovered at all. The effect on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers who heard Ghost Tape number 10 is documented in debriefs of captured soldiers and Chiu Hoi defectors throughout the years the tape was operational. What those debriefs describe is not primarily the expected outcome of a successful psychological operation. What they describe is not soldiers deciding rationally that the tape's message was correct, that the war was unwinnable, that going home was better than dying, that the Americans were offering a genuine path to safety and the right choice was to take it. What they describe is something closer to what happens to a mind when it encounters something it cannot file away in any existing category. One defector, debriefed in 1970, described hearing the tape for the first time from inside a tunnel complex roughly 200 meters from a speaker position. He said that at first, he believed the sound was coming from outside the tunnel and that someone above ground was in distress. He said he told himself this, held on to it. The tunnel was underground. He was surrounded by earth and wood. The sound should not have been able to reach him as clearly as it did, but it did. He described the voice of the dead soldier as sounding, and this is translated from his debrief, not like a recording. Like a man standing at the tunnel entrance. He said that several of the men in the tunnel with him refused to go above ground that night, not because they had orders to stay below, because they would not go up. He said that one man, a young soldier of perhaps 19, sat against the tunnel wall for the duration of the recording with his hands pressed over his ears and did not speak again until morning. He said that the recording played for approximately 6 minutes and then went silent, and that the silence after what had come before it was somehow worse. Another defector described a different deployment of the tape, this one from a helicopter at a position further north. His unit was moving through jungle at night when the helicopter passed overhead. He described the first moment of hearing the sound as physically stunning, a word he repeated in the debrief that the PSYOP officer translating noted was the same word used in Vietnamese for sensation of being struck, physically stunned by a sound. He said that 3 men in his unit, experienced fighters who had been in the jungle for years, broke from the column and ran. Not in a tactical direction, not toward cover or a defensive position, just ran into the jungle away from the sound. He said they were found the next morning 2 kilometers from where the unit had been. He was asked whether the men had been frightened. He said that frightened was not the right word. He said the right word was convinced. They were convinced. Not that the voice was a recording, that it was real. There is a dimension to Operation Wandering Soul that the official histories and the PSYOP assessments and the declassified debriefs all treat as peripheral, as a footnote, as an interesting complication to be noted and then set aside. I do not think it is peripheral. The tape was so effective on South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians that the United States Army issued a formal directive prohibiting its use within effective audible range of friendly Vietnamese forces. Read that again. The United States Army had to issue an order telling its own psychological warfare operators not to use the weapon near their own allies because the allies were as destroyed by it as the enemy. Not ordered not to use it near civilians, though that would have been reasonable, near soldiers, near trained armed military personnel who were fighting alongside the Americans and who knew that American forces were conducting psychological operations in the area and who presumably had been told at some level that the Americans had tools designed to frighten the enemy. It did not matter. Hearing the tape in the dark unmade the knowledge. Whatever the engineers had built into those 6 minutes, whatever combination of sound and frequency and cultural precision, and the specific weight of grief performed by men who understood grief in the particular way that the Vietnamese understood it, it bypassed everything, bypassed the rational mind, bypassed the knowledge that this was a weapon and not a truth, bypassed years of military training and combat experience, and the particular hardening that comes from having already survived things that should not be survivable, and got to something underneath, something that did not know the difference between a recording and reality, something that heard a voice in the jungle at night and believed it. One PSYOP officer who served with the 6th Battalion and spoke about his experiences in an interview decades after the war described what he called the problem with the tape. He said it was not a problem in the military sense. It worked. It achieved its objectives. Soldiers defected. Enemy morale degraded. The operation was, by the metrics available to measure it, a success. The problem, he said, was different. He said that there were men in his unit, American men, PSYOP officers and operators who had worked with the tape for months, who had been part of its production and its deployment, and who understood it technically and operationally as well as anyone could, who began having difficulty with it over time. Not with operating it, they continued to operate it, with the jungle at night, after the operation ended and the equipment was packed away and they were back inside the perimeter. He said that more than one man in his unit, in the weeks and months of sustained operational deployment of Ghost Tape Number 10, reported hearing sounds that were not the tape playing, not a misidentification of the tape or an echo of it or a memory of it, something else. In the jungle, at night, after the mission was over. He said the its medical officer documented 2 formal complaints from PSYOP personnel about auditory experiences that could not be explained by the operational circumstances. Experiences where there was no tape, no equipment, no broadcast of any kind, and men reported hearing voices in the jungle that did not correspond to any identified source. He was asked whether he believed these men. He said that was the wrong question. He said the right question was what the jungle had been before the Americans arrived, and what the tape had done to the relationship between those men and that darkness, and whether, once you have spent months filling a jungle with voices that are designed to feel real, voices calibrated specifically to penetrate into the parts of the human nervous system that process reality before consciousness gets involved, whether something about that changes the jungle or changes you. He did not answer the question. He said he did not know how to answer it. There is one more thing I need to tell you about Ghost Tape Number 10, about what happened at the end of the war. When the Americans left Vietnam in 1975, withdrawing after a conflict that had killed more than 50,000 American soldiers and somewhere between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese, depending on how you count and who you count, the speakers were left behind, not all of them, not most of them, but some of the equipment, the portable units, the speakers that had been hung from trees in the jungle and not always retrieved, the hardware from positions that were abandoned too quickly. In final chaotic withdrawal, for every piece of gear to be accounted for was left in the jungle, in places where nobody would go to retrieve it. And Ghost Tape Number 10, the recording itself, was not destroyed. It was archived. It is in the United States military's historical records. Researchers have located it. Journalists have written about it. Multiple uploads of the recording exist online right now, and you can listen to it in your home with the lights on and understand, intellectually, exactly what it is and how it was made and why every element of it was constructed the way it was, and it is still disturbing, not because of what it says, not because of the Buddhist funeral music, or the technical quality of the recording, or the performance of the man whose voice is on it, because of something that is harder to name. Something that even people who know exactly what the tape is and have listened to it multiple times describe in similar ways, using similar words, regardless of their background or their beliefs or their familiarity with the history of the operation. They describe feeling, on some level beneath the rational understanding of what they are listening to, that the voice is close. Not coming from their speakers, close. The Vietnamese people who lived through the war and in the years after it have their own accounts of the jungle, the sounds, what persists. In the provinces of the Central Highlands, in the areas where Operation Wandering Soul was most heavily deployed, older Vietnamese people speak about the jungle after dark with a specificity that is not general superstition. They are not describing a vague cultural belief in ghosts. They are describing specific experiences, specific sounds, specific qualities of the jungle at night that they say changed during the war and did not entirely change back. There are villages in QU letter 1, E8, 3 and GTR letter 1 East CB province, the same province where Firebase Kate stood, and I do not think that is a coincidence where the people living closest to the jungle say that certain nights, certain conditions of wind and temperature and cloud bring sounds out of the trees, not the tape. They know about the tape. They know its history. They know that American soldiers blasted recordings into the jungle decades ago. They are not naive about this. They say the sounds are not the tape. They say the sounds predate the tape and continue after it. They say the tape was played in those jungles because the Americans understood something about those jungles that they then tried to weaponize. That the Americans did not create the phenomenon. They found it. They studied it. They replicated it as accurately as they could in a Saigon sound studio, and they sent it back into the place it came from without entirely understanding what they were sending it back to. I have been thinking about the man whose voice is on ghost tape number 10, not the dead man he is pretending to be. The actual man, the South Vietnamese soldier or the Viet Cong defector, who sat in a studio in Saigon and spoke into a microphone and said those words. My friends, I come back to let you know that I am dead. I have been thinking about what it would mean to spend an afternoon in a studio performing that. To embody, as convincingly as you can, not death itself, but the specific quality of being dead and aware of it, and unable to stop. To say I am in hell and mean it enough, perform it with enough weight and truth, that men hiding in tunnels 200 meters underground would press their hands over their ears and refuse to go above ground. I have been thinking about what that man did with that experience afterward, whether he dreamed about the recording, whether there were moments years later, in quieter times, when he heard Buddhist funeral music somewhere and felt something he could not account for, whether the voice he put on tape stayed entirely his afterward, or whether, by performing death with sufficient conviction and sending that performance into the jungle at night for years, whether something about that transaction left a remainder, something that the studio could not contain, something that the tape could not hold. Ghost tape number 10 can still be found online. It has been uploaded and re-uploaded dozens of times. People listen to it in the daylight and find it interesting and strange and somewhat unsettling, in the way that knowing a thing's history makes the thing itself feel different. The American soldiers who operated it are mostly old men now. Some are gone. The ones who talked about it, who gave interviews or wrote memoirs or sat down with historians and tried to put into words what it was like to carry that recording into the Vietnamese jungle at night, all described the experience as unlike any other in their military service, not because of the danger. There were things in Vietnam more dangerous than a PSYOP mission because of what the tape did to the space around it, because of the particular quality of the silence after the recording ended and the equipment was packed and the mission was over, and the jungle was just the jungle again. Except that it was not quite just the jungle anymore. You have spent hours filling it with something. You have sent a voice into it. that was designed to be indistinguishable from the real thing. You have tested that voice against the deepest parts of the human nervous system and found that it passes. That something in the darkness processes it as genuine before the mind has a chance to intervene. And now the equipment is off and the voice is gone, and you are walking out of the jungle in the dark, and the jungle is quiet. But you have spent long enough in it doing what you have been doing that you find yourself listening. Not for the enemy, not for tactical threats, for whether anything is walking beside you, whether what you put into the jungle is still there, whether what was in the jungle before you arrived, before the Americans came, before the war, before the tape, in the long history of that darkness that has nothing to do with any of it, whether that is walking beside you too. Most nights there was nothing. Most nights they made it back to the perimeter without incident. And the ones who did not, the ones for whom a PSYOP mission ended differently, who went into the jungle with a speaker and did not come back, whose fates are recorded in the casualty lists as missing in action or killed by unknown causes in circumstances that were never fully reconstructed. Those men are in the records too. Classified records, declassified now, some of them, in the same slow release that is bringing everything else into the light. The jungle kept them, whatever the jungle is, after everything that was done to it. It kept them, and the tape is still out there, playing somewhere for someone, if you listen closely enough, in the right kind of dark.